Thanks, Raphael. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to the Cambridge Centre for Animal Law for inviting me here today. It's a great privilege to present at Cambridge. I used to live in a place called Whittlesford down the road. Fond memories of Cambridge. I think it's an excellent place to be. I only have one PhD, by the way. One PhD is enough. I have a second degree in philosophy, but it's a mere BA. I'm going to talk today about the Animal Welfare Act, the Animal Welfare Sentience Act in the UK, which was passed in April of this year. So my talk is obviously very much focused on a single act within the UK, but everything I do, I try and really maximise the impact, for animal welfare, really. So I very much, hope that you take lessons and principles away from, some of this talk to apply to your own, jurisdictions or countries, assuming probably around half of you are not from the UK. And I think a lot of it, because actually a lot of it's centred around, a lot of this talk is centred around Article 13 of the Treaty of Lisbon. A lot of it is actually quite relevant for EU member states especially. But this summary of the presentation is really, first of all, that Brexit, the UK's departure from the European Union, has led to a real focus on sentience policy. We'll all know that in the field, especially those based in the UK. I would argue, and I think now it's been increasingly realised, that the UK never actually really implemented Article 13 of the Treaty of Lisbon properly, and I would argue, and this is where the relevance comes in for other EU member states, that probably other EU member states don't fully implement it either. Sentient species are certainly excluded in policy making. To properly implement Article 13, we would need at least two processes, some form of animal welfare impact assessment and some form of ethical appraisal of various policy options. So the Animal Sentience Act replaces and strengthens the Article 13, and it's essentially, it sets up the Animal Sentience Committee, which scrutinises government departments on the adverse effects of policy on sentient animals, and I'll talk a bit more about that. There is certainly now an accountability mechanism, which we didn't have before Brexit, but how strong will that accountability mechanism be? What animal welfare impacts will it lead to? I think they will be positive, but the extent of how positive they will be will probably depend upon political factors, which I'll talk about. And then right at the end, I'll just, because we're in a Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights and not animal welfare, and most of my talk is really very much within the animal welfare paradigm. But I'll just say a few words, I guess, about the implications for animal rights. So this is Article 13 of the Treaty of Lisbon. The UK was quite instrumental, actually, in the progenitor of the precursor, of Article 13. During its presidency year, the UK pushed for Article 13, mostly because of the major controversy of live animal exports. Property has come up a lot today as a concept, and the conflict with animal welfare and animal rights, and animals were formerly they are still considered as property. They're traded commercially, and the idea of Article 13 was precisely to recognise that animals aren't just things in the sense of a table or a chair is. They are sentient as well. So there's a sort of a declarative statement, and this is within the EU, sort of a constitutional statement, really, the treaty that binds the EU member states together. Animals are sentient beings, and the EU Commission and member states must pay full regard to the welfare requirements of animals. And I think, and I'd be interested in lawyers' views. I posed the question earlier about, does animal welfare law mean that animals actually have rights? I've asked a similar question to lawyers before about how strong, you know, this is in legal terms as well. What is Article 13? How does it compare to directives and regulations? And I've found I get sort of different conflicting answers to that too. But the European Commission actually qualified this with a statement too. They said this statement puts animal welfare on equal footing with gender equality, the promotion of human health, sustainable development, and even the protection of private data. You know, I mean, I assume many of you work in organisations, so you know that GDPR is a big issue. You know, so animal welfare is important. Gender equality, you know, there's anti-discrimination laws. It's taken very seriously. Obviously, human health. So at least at the level of statements, you know, we've got pretty significant, strong statements within the European Union. When the UK left the European Union, you know, we'd been part of the European Union for 50 years and the precursor to the European Union, the European communities. So if we'd have just left, there would have been a great big lacuna in our legislation. So essentially, you know, government and parliament decided we'll have a great big copy and paste exercise. And basically, we copied and pasted all of the EU legislation in one piece of law, which was the EU withdrawal bill. And this picture is Caroline Lucas, our only Green MP out of our 650 MPs, who's a strong animal welfare and animal rights advocate. And she tabled an amendment to bring across Article 13 because this copy and paste exercise, it brought over all animal welfare legislation, all the directives and the regulations, but it didn't bring over Article 13. And that's because Article 13 is part of the treaty which binds the member states together. So we wouldn't bring that across. But the Conservative party in power whipped its MPs to vote against. Okay, that's not because Conservatives are, you know, nasty politicians, as was reported in some places at the time. That's generally what governments do. You know, governments in power tend to, you know, instruct their MPs to vote against most amendments in this country. But there was a big sort of media furore about MPs denying that animals were sentient and so on. And, you know, their moral and legal status, I would argue, was certainly downgraded. But after a few years, anyhow, you know, well, the Conservative government, you know, then pledged to replace and strengthen Article 13. And here's the Animal Welfare Action Plan, putting sentience at the heart of Johnson's administrative agenda animal welfare agenda in the action plan. So just to wind back a little bit, this slide is really based on my earlier PhD research. So the UK voted to leave the European Union in 2016. I was looking at actually how the UK government accounts for the interests of sentient animals between 2010 to 2015. And essentially the framework that I used was, you know, it was based on what I called 3 principles, and I developed this normative framework. The first one was just that animals are sentient, so they deserve direct moral consideration. The second one was that we live in a liberal democracy, so public policy at some level, including how we treat animals, should reflect public opinion. And the third one was basically Article 13. The UK as a member state of the European Union must pay full regard to animal welfare. So I was looking at DEFRA, the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, which has responsibility for most animal health and welfare policy in the UK, apart from research animals, which is the responsibility of the Home Office. And I was looking at a few case studies: bovine TB, badger cullings, wild animals and sexes, and large indoor dairies. And, you know, so let's look for how the government does actually pay full regard to animal welfare. You know, there's 1 billion land farmed animals that we raise and kill in the UK, most of them chickens, 4 to 5 billion aquatic animals. This is compared to about 70 million people. We'd expect some good structures and processes in place to pay full regard to animals. Maybe a department for sentient animals. We don't have one of those, of course. We've got potential conflicts within DEFRA because they also, you know, understandably want to maximise or increase at least agricultural productivity. Food security is also another principle. So there's certainly no departments, fairly small animal welfare team relative to the number of animals. And the reason this is actually good research to do on the UK as well, and why it's probably useful for other countries, is the UK is a leader in animal welfare too. So there's countries out there, many of them probably with lesser concern for animals. In terms of resources, the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, stated that about £30,000 was spent on each family of humans. And just sort of back of the envelope calculations I did at the time, the direct spend on animal welfare, if you kind of calculate the number of animals involved, amounted to about 0.23 pence per animal. So you can see the sort of the difference in the financial consideration, which is tokenistic consideration really. There's no animal welfare impact assessment. We have environmental impact assessments, health, social impact assessments in the past, equalities impact assessments. All legislation goes through economic impact assessment, but no animal welfare impact assessment, and there's no ethical appraisal. This is a really good example of the exclusion of animals. Essentially, policy officials, kind of look at the costs and benefits. Generally, they're quantified and are monetized. Everything's reduced into dollars or pounds. And this is the central government book where, it sort of instructs policy officials how to inform their ministers, how to analyse policy. And if you search for animal or animal welfare or sentience, you just don't get any returns within that book at all. And this is, I'm very disappointed. I gave a similar talk first about 2018, and I gave an updated version earlier in the summer. I do modify it slightly each time. And I realised it was 2022, and my research had not had an impact on this book because I searched again, and the updated version still doesn't include animal. So Caroline Lucas's amendment essentially shone this spotlight, and I think then actually the NGOs, the RSPCA, Compassion Animal Farming and others, the animal welfare community, I think realised, hang on, were we actually really implementing Article 13? Do we have an accountability mechanism? And the animal welfare advisory and accountability sort of framework within the UK, we of course we have some. We have the Animal Welfare Committee, the Animal Health and Welfare Board of England and so on, but it's kind of patchy. If you go back to the Article 13, member states must pay full regard to animal welfare in the formulation and implementation of policy. That means all of it. It's arbitrary just to look at some of it. And so this is really, I think, what the Animal Sentience Act ends up doing or aiming to do. And to pay full regard to animal welfare, we need to do two things. We need to look at the empirical impacts of policy options on animals. And with Michael Rice, we developed this animal welfare impact assessment, which essentially looks at the positive and negative impacts on animals, including the life and the killing impacts. And the idea is that this would be conducted for all animals significantly affected, for all species significantly affected for each policy option. Here's just an example to illustrate the bovine TB culling option. And the government just doesn't do any of this. It kind of tries to reduce everything into monetary terms, and it's concerned sometimes about conservation. These figures were available for bovine TB because the UK had to abide by the Berne Convention, so it couldn't cause local extinctions of badgers. So there were some figures for badger culling, but in all other policy areas, there's very limited data. And then the ethical, the moral dimension, which we're all aware of. Here's some examples that the Animal Sentience Committee might be interested in, but you can see I've italicized the word should just to show that there's a real moral dimension. And essentially in the 20th century, with a quest for evidence-based policy making, all sort of values are being driven out. There's no real ethical appraisal. Policy is made through science, and if you look in DEFRA as a department, you'll find hundreds of full-time scientists, hundreds of full-time economists, but there won't be any ethicists at all. Ethics is actually essentially reduced into economics. the inherent moral dimension has very much been recognised in human medicine. You know, questions like euthanasia, abortion, xenotransplantation, gene editing. We can't answer those sorts of questions with science. You know, we'll always need ethical appraisal, and we need the same in the animal health and welfare field. So the Animal Welfare Sentience Act, what does it do? It's a very simple piece of legislation. It's about 3 pages long. Section 1 confers a duty on the Secretary of State to establish a committee, which is called the Animal Sentience Committee. Section 2 empowers that committee, the Animal Sentience Committee, to write a report on this single question, which is about whether governments, and this is government departments, are having or have had all due regard to the ways in which policy has an adverse effect on animals as sentient beings. So the Animal Sentience Committee will write a report, and then the third section, Section 3, basically confers a duty on the government departments to then respond to that report and place their own report in Parliament within 3 months. Animals are defined as vertebrates other than Homo sapiens, and also recent research conducted at LSE has meant that now decapod crustaceans and cephalopods are also included. So the committee will be about 8 to 12 members. DEFRA has established what it calls an Animal Welfare Centre of Expertise to group these various committees that we now have, because we also have the Animal Welfare Committee, the Zoo Expert Committee, and the Welfare at Killing Committee, for example. Just a quotation really, during the passage of the bill, there was a lot of concern by animal protectionists about industry groups, you know, sort of dominating this committee, and vice versa, concern about industry groups, about animal rights people. So just this is taken now from the terms of reference from DEFRA, and DEFRA very much want it to be an expert committee, which I think is good. Within the UK, our government, our executive sits within Parliament, the legislature, and the government makes policy, the elected politicians, and the government selected by the Prime Minister make the policy, and then Parliament scrutinises the policy. And the Animal Sentience Committee really can be thought of, you know, sitting between them in a way and sort of furnishing accountability to decision makers for Parliament. So in the terms of reference, this, you know, DEFRA is really at pains to sort of say, you know, the committee is going to be independent. It can act as it wants to act. But, you know, these are our suggestions, which are very sensible suggestions. You know, maybe the committee should look at policy in the round and, you know, decide which policies have greater impact on animals, which are more important, and then choose to focus on certain policies, perhaps due to the scale of the impact or the nature of the impact, or public or parliamentary concern, and so on and so forth. And it outlines, you know, a few basic points about how to write the reports, which is all, you know, quite sensible, including some recommendations. This last couple of slides. Some of the problems, I think the Act can be you know, critiqued at a kind of fundamental level about, if you look carefully at the duties, you know, the duties are to do with producing reports, essentially, setting up a committee and then producing a report, you know, rather than actual sort of stronger duties. Other problems, fiscal policy. DEFRA doesn't expect the committee to be involved in fiscal policy. I'm not really sure why that is. It was probably actually to keep the Treasury on board during the passage of the bill. But fiscal policy is tax and spend policy. You know, it's not like tax and spend policy affects humans but doesn't affect animals at all. You know, so after the financial crisis in 2007, the DEFRA budget was slashed year on year, 70% or so in the end, I think, over several years. Animal welfare team was decimated. This, of course, would have a big impact on animals. I've talked about the importance of ethics, and you see, even after this whole debate that's gone on for years in this country, and the NGOs pushing for consideration of ethics and so on, it's not for the committee to reach a value judgment, which is, as I read it, public sort of policy way of saying, you know, don't do ethics, essentially. Keep the values out again. And actually, there's no duty at all for other government departments to cooperate with the committee. They do have to table a report in response. So a lot depends on the cooperation. What should the committee focus on? They should be very much driven by impact, I would argue, which is a function of the number of animals, intensity and duration of suffering or positive experiences. Largely farmed animals. We don't know the numbers of wild animals so well, but it's largely farmed animals and wild animals. And of those farmed animals, they're largely poultry, meat chickens, over 95% of the land farmed animals killed. So magnitude of animal welfare impact, but also potential for reform. So for example, we haven't had a wild animal welfare type committee, and so there's great big, legislative and advisory and scrutiny gaps there. Low-hanging fruit, potential, concern within Parliament and government, and just some really pictures of the same thing. There's no protection at all, welfare protection for fish at sea. Talking about 4 to 5 billion aquatic animals, so it's great that we've now got crustaceans into the realm as well, with recognition of sentience. I think personally things like pest control. I think what's happened to date is that because of the way that the advisory landscape has been set up, and accounting for public concern, there's great big ongoing debates about things like religious slaughter. Religious slaughter is a debate about instantaneous death versus taking 2 minutes to die for a cow or a sheep, which is important, but these rodenticides, these rats and mice that we're killing, are taking 2 to 3 days bleeding internally, bleeding into their brain and joints, which is very, very painful process. And just because, again, we haven't had the wild animal advisory groups and so on, just because they're considered as pests, because it's not a religious issue, so it doesn't have that emotive aspect, this has been, ignored. And this is something that, public bodies will be funding. They'll actually be paying, for pest control agencies to come in. Michael Seals, who was the former chair of the Animal Health and Welfare Board of England, has been appointed as the chair. I think probably appointed as a safe pair of hands and knowing how government works. The recruitment process is still ongoing for members. Final slide. What does this all mean for animal rights? My view is that animal welfare, it will help a lot. It depends on political factors like how much independence within DEFRA the Animal Sentience Committee has, how much of the departments engage with it, the membership of the committee. But I think from an animal rights point of view and a much more sort of a long-termist viewpoint, I think the focus on sentience, that shared capacity of suffering, will ultimately help going forward. And we had a workshop with a leading legal draftsperson in government not so long ago. And, his view actually privately in the workshop was very much that, this is almost the first sort of step for animal rights. So I thought that was a positive sign. Just some references. Thanks very much for listening.